This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another deck history. In this series, I traced the development of prominent Magic deck archetypes from their origins all the way until the current day. As usual, I ran a poll to determine the topic of this video, and Threshold decks managed to beat out Alurin, so that's what we're looking at today. Threshold is a mechanic that was first introduced in 2001 in Odyssey. It's a mechanic that gives you some sort of bonus or benefit for having 7 or more cards in your graveyard. And a Threshold deck is one that seeks to abuse cards with this mechanic by quickly filling the graveyard. Typically, this results in the Threshold player having very large creatures in the very early portion of the game. At one time or another, Threshold decks have found success in Odyssey Block Constructed, Extended, Legacy, and Vintage. It has the longest history in Legacy, where Threshold decks have been a force since 2005, when Legacy first began to receive competitive events. In this video, we'll look at Threshold decks in each of these formats and discuss how and why these decks have changed over time. The first Threshold deck to find success was actually in Extended, but I want to start with a look at the block version of the deck that top-8'd an event a few months later. It makes a lot more sense to do it this way, because we can get an introduction to the version of the deck with the smallest card pool before taking a look at other formats. Block Constructed was a format where only cards from a single block were legal. In this case, that meant decks could only have cards from Odyssey, Torment, and Judgment. Sylvain L'Oreal top-8'd the Odyssey Block Pro Tour Osaka in 2002 with his blue-green Threshold deck. As you would expect, the deck runs a lot of cards with Threshold. The deck ran 3 different aggressive creatures with the mechanic: Werebear, Seton Scout, and Nimble Mongoose. When Threshold got going, Werebear was a 2-mana 4/4, the Scout was a 2-mana 4/3 with Reach, and Nimble Mongoose was a 1-mana 3/3 with Shroud. In other words, once you got Threshold, those creatures were absolute monsters, especially for the cost. The deck also utilized Centaur Garden, a land with Threshold that can turn into a giant growth. The deck looked to get Threshold going in a few different ways. Wild Mongrel allowed you to discard cards at will, Breakthrough could be used to effectively discard your hand, and Thought Eater gave you an efficient flyer that decreased your hand size, allowing you to quickly discard. It should be noted that this deck also ran several cards with Madness, since the two mechanics actually synergize quite well together. We saw this when we looked at Madness decks a few weeks back. In Block, Madness decks were more focused in on Madness with Threshold as a sub-theme. Meanwhile, Threshold decks like this one had filling the graveyard as a priority, with Madness as the sub-theme. While it doesn't exactly have Threshold, Circular Logic is a good example of how these two mechanics could be used together, since you could discard it and cast it for only a single blue mana, and the more cards you had in your graveyard, the better. Moreover, if you're discarding a bunch of cards, there's also no reason not to run Basking Rootwallow, which frequently becomes a free creature in the deck. Similarly, Roar of the Worm allowed you to get a really cheap 6/6 Worm token, thanks to Flashback. As usual, there was only a single Block Pro Tour. Odyssey Block was also a format at Worlds that year, but no Threshold decks had strong showings there, so that ends the history of Threshold decks in Block Constructed. Before we spend the majority of this video on the Eternal formats, though, we have to rewind a few months and take a look at the Extended Threshold deck that I mentioned earlier. Extended is a now-defunct rotating format that featured the last several years' worth of cards. In late 2001, John Bala top-8'd Grand Prix Las Vegas with his Threshold-Geddon deck. As you can immediately tell from the name, and, the deck list you can see on the screen right now, the deck ran Armageddon, which is a pretty sweet way to get you to Threshold. As has been the case with Armageddon decks throughout the game's history, the main plan was to get ahead on the board, and then blow up all the lands and kill your opponent with your superior board position, and they couldn't do anything about it because they had no lands. Armageddon is a pretty sweet combo with Threshold too, because once you cast it and blow up all your lands, you're pretty likely to get Threshold online. This makes it all the easier to reach a superior board position in the wake of Armageddon. In terms of Threshold cards, this version of the deck ran Werebear, who we've already met, as well as Mystic Enforcer. The Enforcer could quickly close out a game post-Armageddon because it would become a huge flyer with Protection from Black, and Protection from Black was a pretty spicy thing to have in the Extended of 2001. Every other deck that top-8'd Grand Prix Las Vegas had black in it, and that meant it was immune to a bunch of removal and could attack through several of the format's creatures, even if they could fly. However, Grand Prix Las Vegas in 2001 would be the only time a Threshold deck managed the top 8 in Extended. Now, after the rather brief history of Threshold decks in both Block and Extended, let's dive into Legacy, the format where we will spend most of this video, since Threshold decks, as I mentioned earlier, have been around in the format since 2005, when Legacy became a major format supported by Grand Prix and other events. The very first Legacy Grand Prix was in Philadelphia in 2005, and 3 Threshold decks top-8'd the event. Let's take a look at Ben Goodman's version of the deck. This version of the deck goes with Werebear and Mystic Enforcer as its 2 Threshold creatures. Unlike the other versions of the deck we looked at, this one doesn't run dedicated ways to mill yourself or discard cards. Instead, the deck just runs a whole bunch of cheap spells that can quickly fill up the graveyard while drawing you cards. This includes things like Brainstorm, Predict, Serum Visions, and Sleight of Hand. Fetch lands also help to get those 7 cards into the graveyard more quickly. All of this allows you to rip through your deck on the way to Threshold, which is pretty nice. This version of the deck has much more of a tempo control feel to it, running several counterspells, including free ones. One of the other Threshold decks to top 8 the event looked a little bit different, so I do want to touch on it. For one thing, this version of the deck traded in white for red. This gave the deck access to both Lightning Bolt and Fire and Ice, which are highly efficient cards, both at damaging the opponent and getting blockers out of the way, and they can end up in your graveyard quickly because they're cheap. Red also meant that, in addition to the Werebear and the Mongoose, this deck also ran Fledgling Dragon, which basically becomes Shivan Dragon when you get Threshold going, and that was a pretty good deal for 4 mana. About a week later, at the second Legacy Grand Prix ever, Threshold decks finished in the top 2 of the event. This version of the deck went with the Bant colors, but with significantly more creatures than the decks from a week earlier, running a total of 16, including Threshold creatures Mystic Enforcer, Nimble Mongoose, and Werebear. This resulted in a more aggressive Threshold build, somewhat similar to the ones we saw in Block Constructed. One pretty sweet thing about this deck was its use of Worship, which it could combine with the Mongoose. The metagame at the time didn't run very many sweepers, so the Mongoose was incredibly difficult to remove, and if you got Worship in play with the Mongoose, your life total would never let you lose the game. Daniel Crewtail's take on the deck didn't become the dominant one though. Instead, most Threshold decks in the early years of Legacy went a more controlling route, only running a few super efficient creatures who liked the graveyard. From 2005 to 2007, Threshold decks did not change a whole lot. They ran the same suite of creatures and lots of cheap spells to get Threshold going quickly. However, there was a pretty significant change to the deck in 2007. At the 2007 Legacy Championship, 4 Threshold decks finished in the top 8, including Peter Olszewski's, which won the whole event. The biggest change to the deck was the introduction of Tarmogoyf, which was now played alongside our old friends Werebear and Nimble Mongoose. Tarmogoyf was printed in 2007's Future Sight. While the Goyf doesn't technically have Threshold, he plays pretty similarly to cards featuring the mechanic, since he effectively gets bigger the more cards there are in your graveyard, and he often amounts to being a 2-mana 5/6 or something like that. Because Threshold decks were already trying to rapidly fill the graveyard, Tarmogoyf just ended up being a great fit, in a lot of ways giving the deck access to a better version of Werebear. While this version of the deck runs both Tarmogoyf and Werebear, the Goyf would come to replace Werebear as it was simply the better 2-drop creature. This meant that now, typically the only card in the deck that actually had Threshold was Nimble Mongoose, and this was something that would remain true about Threshold decks for several years, with David Kaplan's top 8 deck from 2009's Grand Prix Chicago an example of this new direction. In a lot of ways, it was a throwback to the Teamer Threshold decks that were present in Legacy back in 2005, which we covered earlier in the video. Like those decks, this deck's use of red allowed it to play both Lightning Bolt and Fire and Ice. From this point on, these rug Threshold decks really became the primary form of the deck. They now went with the Teamer colors and ran more spells and fewer creatures. The plan was to stick 1 or 2 of your creatures, get them big, and play a control game and a tempo game while you quickly lowered your opponent's life total with your creatures. The deck would go on to take on the name Canadian Threshold, as David Kaplan was himself Canadian. The Canadian name has stuck around on Teamer Threshold decks all the way to the modern day as a result. Threshold decks would undergo their next major transformation in 2011, and this change largely occurred as a result of the printing of another new, cheap creature who could quickly become larger. At Grand Prix Amsterdam in 2011, Ciro Bonaventura piloted his Canadian Threshold deck to a second-place finish. Now, the deck featured the newly printed Delver of Secrets. It slotted into the Canadian Threshold shell quite well, because the deck already had an incredibly high count of instants and sorceries, so transforming the Delver into Insectile Aberration was pretty easy. This was especially true thanks to Ponder and Brainstorm, which could make it even easier to transform it because they let you manipulate the top of your deck. This meant that the Delver could team up with Nimble Mongoose to be another 1-mana 3-power creature. From here, Delver would become a card that was usually featured in Threshold decks. From this point on, the name Rug Delver is also used fairly interchangeably with Canadian Threshold. While Canadian Threshold would go on to be the version of the deck that would have the most frequent and long-term success, 2012 also saw the arrival of a new Threshold deck that has also been relevant in Legacy for several years, though it isn't nearly as prominent as the Canadian version. In 2012, Kyle Edwards top-8'd an SCG Open in Dallas with his Bug Threshold deck. This deck switches red out for black, primarily to gain access to the powerful Abrupt Decay, which blows up many permanents in Legacy and can't be countered. The deck also uses Ghastly Demise, which goes well with the Threshold theme because it's better the more cards there are in their graveyard. In addition to Delver, the Mongoose, and Tarmogoyf, this version of the deck also runs Vendilion Click, a very nice evasive and disruptive creature. Bug Delver has never really found the same level of success as Canadian Threshold, but they have found sporadic success in the format all the way through to 2019. Meanwhile, Canadian Threshold decks would go a few years before undergoing any other significant changes. Some decks tried different configurations of creatures, but they still pretty much always went with the trio of Delver of Secrets, Nimble Mongoose, and Tarmogoyf over the next few years. By 2016, though, the deck started to look significantly different. As you can see, there's not a single creature in this deck that actually has Threshold. The deck still runs creatures who like the graveyard, including Tarmogoyf and Hooting Mandrills, though. If you load your graveyard quickly enough, the Mandrills ends up as a 1-mana 4/4, and as we've seen, that's really the name of the game with these decks. Play really efficient 1 and 2 drops. The deck also features a singleton True Name Nemesis, a creature that is almost impossible for the opponent to interact with. Now, not all Threshold decks going forward would get rid of the Mongoose, but this kind of deck shows you how the Threshold name doesn't even necessarily have to do with the mechanic at this point. From this point on, it was no guarantee that Nimble Mongoose would actually make the deck, as the deck moved towards playing different green 1-drops like the Mandrills. Many Threshold decks were still running the Mongoose as late as 2018. Alexander Chen top-8'd Grand Prix Richmond in 2018 with such a deck, featuring Delver and the Mongoose along with Tarmogoyf and True Name Nemesis. However, Threshold decks would eventually end up not running any cards with Threshold more consistently, with Nimble Mongoose pretty much phased out by 2019. By 2020, as you can see here, Threshold decks began also heavily featuring Dreadhorde Arcanist, a powerful 2-drop that could cast a huge chunk of the deck's spells from the graveyard when it attacked. We've seen this trend the whole time with these Threshold decks. They started with lots of cards with the actual mechanic, but they slowly shifted away from that mechanic while still featuring cheap and efficient creatures who give you some graveyard value, and Dreadhorde Arcanist is another card in that same vein. Now, let's fast forward all the way to the present day to get a look at Canadian Threshold decks right now. One really important creature was printed in 2021's Modern Horizons 2 that almost immediately made an impact, and that's Murktide Regent. It is an absolutely insane delve creature for the deck because it can not only be cast really easily, because the deck's graveyard always is filled with spells, but it can also be absolutely massive in the very early game, and it can end the game with a lot fewer swings than Tarmogoyf or Delver of Secrets can. So today's Threshold decks in Legacy certainly don't look the same as they did in 2005, but they certainly are the direct descendants of the Threshold decks that began to find success in Legacy from the very beginning. And that means the Threshold decks have had a really impressive run in terms of actually always being pretty successful in the Legacy format over the last 17 plus years. We do still have one more format to look at, and that's Vintage. While Threshold decks haven't been nearly as successful there as they have been in Legacy, they've done some work there. Although it's debatable that most of these decks should really be thought of as Threshold decks, but that's the name these decks are given, so we may as well take a look. Let's start with a look at a deck that Christian Griffin top-8'd 2014's Vintage Championship with. As you can see, this deck also doesn't run any cards with Threshold, and it doesn't even run a single creature that actually does anything with the graveyard. Really, the only thing this Vintage Threshold deck has in common with the Legacy variant is that it's in the Temur colors and runs a bunch of tempo creatures. This version of the deck really feels more like a Delver deck, though, than a Threshold deck, especially because Young Pyromancer, another spell payoff, is in the deck. If we fast forward to 2021, we do see a version of the deck that is significantly more graveyardy. This version of the deck runs a single Tarmogoyf along with Dreadhorde Arcanist and Deathrite Shaman, all of which are powerful creatures who can abuse the graveyard. Notably, this version of the deck also branches into black significantly while still maintaining the Canadian Threshold name. In general though, Threshold decks have not really made a huge impact on the Vintage format. You can expect to see them around, but they're certainly not one of the format-defining decks. So that's the history of Threshold decks. They started out as decks really focused on the mechanic in both block and extended, and they started out really focused on Threshold and Legacy too. But over time, Canadian Threshold came to be a name that was applied to any teamer deck that ran a bunch of creatures who were cheap and loved the graveyard, while backing things up with burn and other removal spells. Well, that does it for this video. If you want to have a say in the topic of next week's deck history, check out the community tab where you can vote in the poll. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch up on past deck history videos, and there are over 25 of them, you can see the playlist on your screen shortly. If you want to stay aware of future deck history videos, subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.